empires that are expanding in the 15 and 1600s. Okay, I've given you kind of a list of the major European players that you do need to know and the areas of the world they spread into. Notice for each of them, most of them were in the Americas and then somewhere around the Indian Ocean basin. You do need to know these major players. You do need to know kind of generally where they settled their colonies and where they took over. But beyond that, you don't need to know like every single detail about all 5 of these countries and their new empires. In fact, what I would suggest is spend some time doing a deep dive of one of them. You pick one, whichever one you're interested in, do a deep dive of that and know one of them really, really well, because that could possibly be outside evidence for the DBQ. If the DBQ has something to do with this topic, and you can bring in details about the French in the Caribbean or up in modern day Canada, well, that's going to be really helpful. That's going to get you a few extra points on the DBQ. So don't feel like you have to know every single thing about all 5 of these. Instead, know a little bit about each one, generally where they are, and then do a deep dive on whichever one you're interested in. And that'll be plenty. Also today, as we're talking about this expansion of European empires, I'm not going to talk too much about its effects on Europe. Instead, we're going to look at the impact that it has on other parts of the world, mainly the area of Asia around the Indian Ocean, West Africa, and the Americas are where we're going to look. And the reason for that is because there is this temptation when teaching world history to kind of fall into the trap of being too Eurocentric. And I don't know if your teacher has talked to you about this before or mentioned in class, but I think it is important for you to understand, because we're getting to that point in history where Europe is starting to become a major political, military, and economic power. And we're going to see it here. We're going to see it after the Industrial Revolution, and it continues on until the 20th century. And I'll just tell you from personal experience, for a lot of teachers, when we were in school, world history was extremely Eurocentric. Okay, I took world history when I was in high school back in the day. But back then, world history meant we studied what happened in Europe and we studied the United States, and that was it. We barely ever touched anything in Asia or Africa or South America. It was Europe, it was the United States, it was a Western Civ class. But fortunately, over the last several years, there has been this push by historians to say, look, if you're teaching world history, then you should, teach everything in the world and not just in one continent. So today I want to take a special look at other parts of the world that are being impacted by this expansion of European empires. All right, so let's start with Asia, and more specifically, the area around the Indian Ocean. So that incorporates South Asia, Southeast Asia, also East Africa as well, because that coastline had a lot of ports. They're very important for Indian Ocean trade. Okay, we know that Indian Ocean trade has been a thing for several centuries before this. We have talked about it already before in these videos. You talked about it in class. The Portuguese arrive. After that, other European merchants begin arriving, and European merchants become the ones that in many cases are shipping goods to all these different regions of Africa and Asia. They're taking goods from, let's say, South Asia, from India, and bringing them to Southeast Asia or into China. They're also the ones that are bringing in silver. Okay, let's talk about silver here for a second, because it's an extremely important part of this long distance trade that you need to understand. Silver ends up becoming essentially kind of a worldwide currency that can be used almost anywhere to buy and sell goods. Now remember, gold has always kind of been a type of worldwide currency. Gold is valuable almost everywhere. But the problem is that gold is so rare that it's just not practical to be a real currency. And yes, I know the reason why gold is so expensive is because it is rare. But again, it's just not practical because there's not that much gold to go around the world. But once silver is discovered in the Americas, and once the Spanish and Portuguese begin building mines in South America to get the silver out of the ground, they start using it in commerce around the world. And the thing about silver is it's still fairly valuable, but there's enough of it to where it can be a practical currency. So now the Portuguese and the Spanish, as they arrive in Asia, have something that everybody else wants. And it ends up becoming a currency all around the Indian Ocean. Now, you know that this is also the time that leaders of the Ming Dynasty in China began requiring that Chinese citizens pay their taxes in silver coin. Previously, Chinese citizens could have paid their taxes in almost any type of currency or in crops or in animals or anything like that. But now they're being required to pay it in silver. So now there's a huge high demand for silver in East Asia. So make sure you understand the importance of silver in all the Indian Ocean trade as well. We also, though, do start to see China and especially Japan begin closing themselves off to this European influence. Not completely at all, but for example, in Japan, there was only one port where European merchants were allowed to enter and exit and to sell goods. There were Christian missionaries that went to Japan, but after a while that was outlawed. Missionaries were not allowed, Christian missionaries were not allowed in Japan. By the way, if you want a really good book recommendation, the book Silence. It's absolutely fantastic. It's about a couple of Portuguese missionaries that traveled to Japan in the 1600s. And they actually made a movie out of it a couple of years ago. Martin Scorsese directed it, and it had, oh, what's the guy's name? The actor, he plays Kylo Ren. Y'all know who I'm talking about. The Driver, Adam Driver. That's the one. Yeah. All right. Took me a little while. Adam Driver's in it. I never saw the movie, so I can't recommend it. In fact, I heard it's pretty violent, so maybe you shouldn't watch it, but the book is fantastic. But anyway, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah. So we do see some countries trying to stop this European expansion into their countries. We also see empires like the Spanish and the Dutch begin taking over parts of the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. But then we also see countries like England who are beginning to kind of sort of take over India, but not a complete takeover yet. We know that's coming, right? That the British will eventually take over India. But remember, at this point, the Mughal Empire is still going strong in India. The British just are not going to be able to beat them at all. But you do see the British starting to set up in port cities all along the coast of India. And from there, we're going to see this kind of slow encroachment, slowly moving into India, where eventually they're going to take it over. But make sure you kind of understand the differences in how these empires are expanding and how much control they have over the territory that they're colonizing. Okay, real quickly, this box right here. This is from the DBQ that you've been working on the last couple of nights. This is, I believe, document 5 in it. This is actually from last year's AP test. This was the DBQ in last year's AP test. I took out 2 documents to make it a 5-document one. But I keep talking about that kind of one weird document. Last year, this was the one weird document. This is the one that drove students nuts. I was grading these last year for the AP test, and there were so many students that either skipped this document or messed up when they were talking about it. And even my own students later on were complaining, like, why is there a box? Why is there a picture of a box? What does that have to do with anything? In fact, if you have any friends that took AP World last year, ask them about the DBQ and ask them about the box, and I'm sure they're going to go on a long rant about it. But even though this box looks kind of weird, and like, what does this have to do with the Portuguese or any of that? You can still use it in a DBQ. I mean, look at the description. We know that it's extremely expensive. It's got ebony, it's got ivory, it's got a lot of really expensive things in it. We also know from the tagline here that it was meant to be exported to Portugal. So that tells us a couple of things here. One, it shows us how involved the Portuguese now are in Indian Ocean trade. It also shows us that there's a really large desire or market for expensive goods from Asia in Europe. Wealthy Europeans are wanting to purchase really exotic imports from Asia. So even though it's just a picture of a box, there are things that we find out about it and we can use it in our DBQ. So remember, that's what I've been saying. There's going to be that one weird document. Figure out a way to use it anyway. And hey, if you write something and it's wrong, that's okay, because you're going to use the other 4 documents correctly and still get the points. So you'll be okay. All right, let's talk about a historical situation real quick, because remember, that is one way that you can source a document on the test. Remember, for this year's rubric, you're going to have to source 2 documents, and you can get 2 points if you do it. But it's not just a matter of identifying the point of view, purpose, audience, or historical situation. You also need to kind of explain the so what of it. Why is it important? So we're going to practice that today a couple of times. Here, I've given you a prompt at the top, social and economic effects of the global flow of silver. And what I'd like for you to do is to pause the video, read the document, and then you don't need to worry about making a claim or any of that right now. We're not doing thesis statements, but let's think about sourcing. If you were going to write this DBQ, how would you source this document? All right, so pause the video, take a couple minutes. When you're ready, unpause, and I'll go over the answers with you. Ready? Go. All right, welcome back. If we're going to talk about historical situation, notice this is being written in China. He's talking about the fact that dye shops in China are now expecting customers to pay in silver, because the dye shop itself also needs silver to be able to pay its taxes to the Ming officials. So if I'm talking about historical situation, I'm definitely going to bring in the fact that the Ming officials are expecting taxes to be paid in silver. That means that everyone needs that hard currency. They need silver coins. And so now you see less of a bartering type of economy, where even if you went to the store, you used to be able to pay with, well, you can see there, rice, wheat, soybeans, chickens, whatever. But now customers are being expected to pay in hard currency and silver coin. So that's definitely a social effect of the global flow of silver. So notice I identified the historical situation, and then I explained why that's important. I gave the so what of it, and I connected it back to the topic of the prompt. So that's what you need to do for, again, at least 2 documents. But as I said the other day, you might want to try it for 3, because sourcing, it can be tough to do. And if you try it for 3 and you mess up on 1, that's okay, because you've still done 2 correctly. You can still get those 2 points. All right, let's move on and talk about Africa and the impact that European expansion had on Africa. Now, yesterday, Smith did a really great job of talking about the slave trade from Africa to the Americas. So we're not going to rehash that. But if you want more details on it, definitely go watch Smith's video from yesterday. But remember that even pre-European arrival, there had been a slave trade, especially in North Africa, where we usually saw people being kidnapped and enslaved and sent to places like the Middle East. But it was kind of a small trade. When Europeans arrive, the whole thing just explodes in numbers. And we see a massive forced migration of humans from Africa to the Americas. And there were some that went to Europe, and there were still some that went to the Middle East, but the vast, vast majority went to the Americas. Okay, like I said, Smith talked about that yesterday, so we're not going to go into detail on it, but let's think about the impact that that has on the people that remained in Africa. First off, you actually do see the rise of some larger kingdoms in Africa, like the Ashanti and the Kingdom of the Congo. You should be familiar with those for a couple of reasons. One, there's a massive, trade network going through North Africa, connecting them now to the Americas and still to the Indian Ocean. And it's not just slaves, it's also foodstuffs as well from Africa. And we still have the gold and salt trade from West Africa across the Sahara Desert. So there is some money flowing into these kingdoms from all of this long distance trade. Also, we see a population increase in a lot of these centralized governments of Africa, because what you need to remember is that typically speaking, the people that were kidnapped and enslaved usually came from rural areas. If you were by yourself in a rural area, that was extremely unsafe. Typically, you did not see as many people being enslaved that lived in these powerful kingdoms or in urban areas, the whole like safety in numbers type of thing. So as the slave trade begins to increase, you see a lot of people moving from rural areas into more established governments and into urban areas. So the population of these larger kingdoms is growing. Again, that means more economic and military power for these kingdoms. Also, remember that the majority of people that are enslaved were usually men. Of course, there were women enslaved as well, but the majority were men. So in parts of West Africa, you have now a gender imbalance because, again, most people that were enslaved came from West Africa, or at least a large number of them. So there are some regions where there are a lot more women than men. And so for the women that are staying behind in Africa, they're having to take on traditional male roles in those economies. So it's affecting social life and gender relations as well in Africa. And then we also really need to consider the impact that it has on the economy and the demographics of Africa. Now, a lot of times students think that the population of Africa declined this time because so many people were being forced in migration to the Americas. It's not that the population of Africa declined. In fact, the population of Africa over these couple centuries did increase. But the problem is that the population in other parts of the world is also increasing much faster. The population of Europe is exploding. So relatively speaking, the population of Africa is increasing at a much slower rate than other parts of the world, especially Europe and the Americas. So that's going to have an economic impact if you don't have as many people. Also consider that most of the people that were enslaved were usually pretty young. So if you have someone who's say 20, 25 years old, who's now being forced to go to the Americas, well, that's someone who is going to be working for the next several decades. So now the place that they came from is missing out on a bunch of economic production over the next several decades, and it's been taken from them. And then you got to consider with population, these are young men and women that are being enslaved, young men and women who would have stayed and had kids. So you're missing out on the possible kids that were born, and the kids of those kids, and the kids of those kids, on through the generations. So it has a huge negative economic and demographic impact on Africa, especially in West Africa. All right, let's take a second and do another sourcing. I've got a different prompt here for you, so take a look, make sure you read it. Here we're talking about African slaves and their descendants and how they're seeking freedom in the Atlantic world. And we have a Spanish governor in Costa Rica, because this, of course, was part of the Spanish Empire of the Americas. So again, I want you to take some time. You're going to pause the video. You're going to read the document. And then, again, think about sourcing. All right? Especially think about historical situation and what's going on here. All right, so go ahead and pause now. All right, welcome back. Possible answers that you could have mentioned here if we're talking about historical situation. You could have talked about the encomienda and hacienda systems of labor in Spanish America. You could have also talked about the racial structure of Spanish America. And Smith is going to go into this a little bit tomorrow, so I don't want to go too far into it. But remember that in Spanish America, there was a very rigid class structure, or racial structure, I should say, set up, depending on what race you were, whether you're Spanish, whether you're African, whether you're Native American, or some kind of mixture of different ones. And very rigid system based on all of that. And you can see it mentioned here in the very first sentence when talking about all the different groups and different races. You could also see examples of the encomienda and hacienda systems in line 3 when talking about living in Christian discipline. Because remember, Spanish overseers were put in charge of making sure that Native Americans in their area were working, but they were also expected to make sure those Native Americans were becoming Christian and practicing Christianity. So again, you can use some of that historical situation and bring it to bear on the document and explain that, and then it helps better illuminate the document and helps better understand the prompt. All right, as far as the Americas go, if we're talking about regions of the world that were impacted by European expansion, I would say, of course, the Americas probably had the largest impact, no doubt about it. Yesterday, Smith talked about diseases that Europeans brought to the Americas, especially smallpox and others. So again, we're not going to go through too much of that, but make sure that you go back and watch that video. But that, of course, leads to a massive, massive population decline. I mean, estimates vary, of course, but it could have been upwards of 90% of the population of the Americas in this time died from diseases that Europeans brought over. That's insane when you think about it. There was a great book I read a couple years ago, and I was trying to remember the name of it and the author today, and I could not remember it. But he was talking about this idea that for so long, the story was told of Europeans like Columbus discovered America, and they tamed the wilderness, and they brought civilization. Okay, no, that's a bunch of baloney. And this author pointed out, he said, Europeans didn't tame the wilderness of the Americas. They created the wilderness. When 90% of the population dies off, then yeah, it's going to look like a wilderness. But we know that there were large civilizations and empires, like the Aztecs and Incas, that were almost wiped out because of Europeans, Spanish, and Portuguese coming into South America and Central America. You know, and here the Spanish are thinking that they can conquer, and they conquered it pretty easily. Well, yeah, because 90% of the population died off from disease before fighting even started. And the Spanish had guns. And if you have guns and you have diseases, it's going to be a pretty quick takeover. Make sure you know about the different labor systems that we see in the Americas. We've already talked about slavery, or at least Smith did yesterday. Make sure you know about indentured servants also. People that came to the Americas and were willing to work for passage to the Americas, but in a lot of cases, they're working in some of the same conditions as slaves and turns into almost slave-like conditions. It's definitely a form of coerced labor. And then, as we mentioned already, you need to know about the encomienda and hacienda systems as well, that the Spanish organize in order to organize labor of the Native Americans. But also consider the natural resources that were taken from the Americas. We already mentioned silver. The Spanish and Portuguese discover silver underground in South America. They start building mines, they pump the silver out, and then they start sending it across the world. So the Spanish and Portuguese kings are making a ton of money, and merchants are making a ton of money off of this silver. This isn't necessarily, though, benefiting the people of the Americas. So when we talk about the rise of Europe in this time, and I said already, you know, they're going to become economic and military powerhouse. These countries are. Well, yeah, they are, because they're enslaving people from some parts of the world. They're stealing natural resources from other parts of the world. When you do that, you're going to make a lot of money. And that's really what we see with the rise of Europe in this time.